Jake had always considered his backyard a personal sanctuary, his escape from the world. It was his quiet space, where he could unwind with a cup of coffee and forget about everything. But one morning, as he stepped outside, something felt different. A sense of unease washed over him as he looked across his well-maintained lawn. The air, once calm and peaceful, suddenly felt thick with tension. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. Maybe it was too early, maybe he hadn't had enough coffee. But no, it was real. His perfect lawn was covered with footprints, and in the middle of it stood a group of kids running wild, laughing like they owned the place. Jake blinked in disbelief. Then, as if that wasn't enough, he spotted a couple lounging under his favorite oak tree. They were casually eating sandwiches on a blanket, as if they were in a public park. The same park that didn't exist, at least not in his mind. Confusion turned to frustration as he marched over to them. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice shaking. "Can I help you?" The woman barely looked up from her sandwich, smiling lazily. "Oh, we're just enjoying the new park," she said. "It's a great spot." Jake's mind raced. New park. His stomach dropped. He turned, scanning the yard, and that's when he saw it, a bright green sign near the back gate with bold white letters. Community Park, open to residents. His blood ran cold. Was this a joke? Was he being pranked? His heart pounded as he approached the sign, disbelief clouding his thoughts. Before he could say another word, he heard a voice from behind him. "I see you've noticed our little project," Karen said, stepping into view with her signature smug grin. The war for his yard had just begun. Jake's heart was still racing when he turned back to Karen, holding the sign that read, Community Park, open to residents. His hand trembled as he looked from the sign to Karen, who stood there with a smug expression, clearly pleased with herself. "What is this?" he asked, his voice thick with frustration. "Why is my yard suddenly a park?" Karen sighed dramatically, almost as if explaining something to a child. "Oh, we had a community meeting last week, Jake. We all agreed that your backyard would make a lovely addition to the new park," she said, her tone overly sweet. "It's such a great spot, underutilized really." "Underutilized?" Jake repeated, his mind racing. "This is my private property. You can't just turn it into a park without asking me." Karen shrugged casually. "Technically, it's your property, yes. But since you aren't part of the HOA, you wouldn't have been at the meeting where we discussed this. You see, we thought it would be better for the whole community to have more accessible green space." She gave him a pointed look. "You should really consider joining the HOA. You'll be part of decisions like these. It's about the neighborhood's well-being." Jake's blood boiled. "You can't just take my yard like this, Karen. This is ridiculous." He glanced around at the people who were now beginning to settle in on his lawn, oblivious to his growing anger. Karen's smile only grew wider. "It's not about taking it, Jake. We're just making it more accessible. Think of it as a gift to the community." She waved a hand as if dismissing his concerns. "I'm sure everyone will love it." Jake clenched his fists, trying to keep his composure. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. This wasn't just a mistake. Karen and the HOA were intentionally trying to steal his backyard under the guise of community improvement. It was so typical of Karen. She thrived on control, and now she was using the HOA's power to push him around. He demanded, "I want this sign gone. Now." Karen raised an eyebrow. "Jake, don't be dramatic. You're overreacting. We have approval from the HOA board." She glanced at the sign and then back at him with that same insufferable smirk. "It's all perfectly legal." "No, it's not," Jake snapped. "This isn't legal. I never agreed to any of this." Karen's expression didn't falter. "If you had attended the HOA meeting, you'd understand. We've already voted on it. You should really consider participating in community decisions, Jake. It'll make things easier for everyone." Jake stood there, feeling the weight of her words pressing on him. He had refused to join the HOA for years, not wanting to get caught up in their ridiculous rules and power games. But now, he saw it for what it really was, an organized attempt to take control of his life, starting with his own backyard. "I'm not part of your HOA, Karen," Jake said through gritted teeth. "And I'm not going to let you or anyone else take my property." Karen simply nodded, unfazed. "Well, you should think about it. Maybe next time, you'll be more open-minded." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jake standing there, still holding the sign. As soon as she was gone, Jake marched to the sign and ripped it out of the ground. He threw it into the trash, feeling a small sense of victory. But deep down, he knew this wouldn't be the end of it. He had no idea just how far Karen and the HOA were willing to go to claim his land. That night, after tossing and turning in frustration, Jake woke up to an even worse surprise. The next morning, he found a new sign standing in his yard, bigger, sturdier, and cemented firmly into the ground. His stomach sank. It was clear Karen wasn't going to give up that easily. She had won the first round, but Jake wasn't about to back down. He knew he had to do something before things got even worse. Jake wasn't going to let this slide. That night, he took the sign and tossed it into the trash, hoping that would end the absurd situation. He felt a sense of relief, thinking that it was all over. But when the sun came up the next morning, his heart sank. There, right where the old sign had been, stood a brand new one. This time even bigger and sturdier, cemented firmly into the ground. Jake's frustration bubbled up, but this time it was mixed with a cold realization. Karen and the HOA weren't going to back off. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. It was a plan, and they were determined to take control of his property. The weight of the situation began to settle in. Jake couldn't just stand by and watch this happen. He needed to prepare for a fight. As the day wore on, Jake tried to go about his usual routine, but something felt different. Every time he stepped outside, he couldn't help but glance at the sign. His thoughts kept racing. What was the next step? How far would Karen and the HOA go to claim his yard? The escalation didn't take long. By mid-afternoon, Jake looked out his window and saw a group of children running through his yard, their laughter echoing in the air. A couple of them were kicking a soccer ball around, completely oblivious to the fact that they were on private property. Jake stood there, stunned, but before he could do anything, he saw something even worse. A group of strangers had set up camp in the corner of his backyard. A few folding chairs were scattered around, and people were lounging like they owned the place. A couple of moms had made themselves comfortable on his patio furniture, chatting like they were at a family picnic. Jake stormed outside, his heart pounding in his chest. He walked across the yard, trying to keep his anger in check. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" he demanded. One of the moms looked up, taken aback. "Oh, Karen said this was a community space now," she explained, her voice full of confusion. "No, it's not." Jake snapped, his fists clenching at his sides. "This is private property, my property." His voice had grown louder, and the crowd started to take notice. Before anyone could respond, Karen appeared. She was flanked by two other HOA members, both wearing identical smug expressions. Jake's blood boiled. "This is ridiculous," he yelled, feeling the heat of his anger rise. "You can't just take my yard and turn it into a public park." Karen gave him an exaggerated sigh, as if she were explaining something to a stubborn child. "Jake, you're being dramatic. This is for the good of the neighborhood. We just want to make the space more accessible to everyone. You should really be more neighborly." "I don't care about being neighborly," Jake shot back. "You have no right to come into my backyard and tell me how to use it. I want you all to leave now." One of the other HOA members, a man Jake hadn't seen before, raised his eyebrows and stepped forward. "Jake, you're really making this harder than it needs to be. The community needs this space." Jake's patience snapped. "I don't care about your community space. Show me the paperwork. You can't just make my backyard into a park without legal backing. Where's the official approval?" Karen didn't even flinch. "Oh, it's in the process of being finalized," she said, waving her hand dismissively. "You should really consider participating in community decisions. It's good for everyone." Jake felt his head spin. "You're telling me you don't have anything in writing, but you're treating this like it's already done?" He took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "This is my property, and I'm telling you to get off it." Karen just shook her head, a patronizing smile on her face. "You really need to calm down, Jake. We're not trying to take anything from you. We're just making it better for the whole neighborhood. You'll see." With that, she turned and walked away, the other two HOA members following her. Jake stood there, seething with frustration. His backyard was now a public gathering spot, filled with strangers, and no one was listening to him. He felt like he was losing control over his own property, and there wasn't much he could do about it. The worst part was the smug look on Karen's face as she walked away, as if she'd already won. Jake turned to the group still lounging in his yard, eyes burning with anger. "Get out. Now," he said, his voice low and firm. One by one, the strangers packed up, clearly annoyed by his insistence, but realizing there was no arguing with him. As the last of them left, Jake stood by the gate, staring at the sign. His blood was still boiling. This was only the beginning. He couldn't let Karen or the HOA take what was rightfully his. But it was clear now that things were escalating fast, and he had to act quickly before he lost everything. Jake spent the next few days feeling increasingly angry and helpless. Every time he stepped outside, he saw the sign standing tall in his backyard, mocking him. He couldn't believe it was happening. His own property was being claimed by the HOA and Karen without his consent. But he wasn't ready to give up. He knew he had to do something smart, before Karen and the HOA took it any further. He started researching. Late nights turned into early mornings as Jake read through zoning laws, property rights, and anything else he could find on HOA regulations. He even dug into local ordinances and government websites. After hours of digging, he found it, the loophole. As long as he didn't abandon the land or leave it in a state of neglect, the HOA couldn't touch it. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He now knew that as long as he maintained his property, the HOA had no legal grounds to seize it. But that didn't mean they were going to leave him alone. Jake soon realized Karen wasn't just pushing boundaries. She was actively sabotaging him. The small things started to add up. His garden hose was sliced clean through one morning, with no sign of how it had happened. His trash cans disappeared from the curb, only to show up days later, miles away from his house. The worst part was the backyard gate. He would lock it at night, but each morning it was mysteriously left wide open. Jake felt the weight of the situation sinking in. He wasn't just dealing with a neighbor pushing her agenda. He was being actively targeted. He decided to take action. One evening, he set up security cameras around his yard. He figured that if Karen and her crew were behind this, he'd have proof. It didn't take long before the footage confirmed his suspicions. One night, just after midnight, Jake watched as Karen snuck onto his property. The camera captured her in clear view as she carefully removed the sign he had taken down days ago and replaced it with a new one. She smiled to herself, proud of her work, before sneaking off again. Jake sat there, fuming with disbelief. Karen wasn't going to stop, not until she had what she wanted. He could see it now. She was doing whatever it took to make his property look like it was abandoned, neglected, and up for grabs. If she could get enough people to believe the land was no longer being cared for, she'd have a stronger case for taking it from him. The realization hit Jake like a ton of bricks. He couldn't just sit back and hope it would go away. He had to take matters into his own hands. And this time, he wouldn't just fight back, he'd fight smart. That night, as he sat on his porch, Jake let the ideas swirl in his mind. He thought about all the ways he could make his backyard so unappealing that no one, not even Karen and the HOA, would want to claim it. He couldn't just tear up the sign again. That wasn't enough. He needed something bigger, something that would make the idea of turning his backyard into a public park seem like the worst idea in the world. After hours of brainstorming, Jake had an idea. A plan so ridiculous, it just might work. He decided to turn his yard into a swamp, a real, honest-to-goodness wetland. A place filled with mud, stagnant water, and enough mosquitoes to make anyone think twice about walking in. Jake started making a list. He would need tarps to trap water, a way to flood certain areas, and some plants that would thrive in wet conditions. He could even get some frogs and tadpoles to really make it feel like a true wetland. The best part, once it was established as a wetland, it would be protected by environmental laws. The HOA wouldn't be able to do anything about it. He grinned. It was perfect. If Karen wanted a community park, she was going to get one, but not the one she was expecting. The next morning, Jake wasted no time. He went online and ordered everything he'd need. As the days passed, he began preparing. He rerouted his sprinklers, created small ponds, and strategically placed tarps and waterproof barriers. Each step brought him closer to his goal. But there was still one thing left to do. Jake had to act quickly. He knew that once Karen realized what he was doing, she would stop at nothing to undo it. But for now, she had no idea what was coming. Jake was ready to turn his backyard into something so unappealing, Karen and the HOA would be forced to back off, permanently. Jake had always been a fan of thinking outside the box, but this time, his idea was something truly unexpected. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that turning his backyard into a swamp might just be the perfect way to stop Karen and the HOA in their tracks. The best part? There was a legal loophole. If the land became a wetland, it would be protected by environmental laws, and no one, not Karen, not the HOA, could do a thing about it. Jake wasted no time. He ordered everything he needed, a mix of tarps, waterproof barriers, irrigation equipment, and wetland plants. He even found a local supplier who sold tadpoles and frogs. This was going to be a swamp, all right. The kind of swamp that would make anyone think twice before trying to claim it. The delivery came in several parts, and Jake quickly started to put his plan into action. First, he focused on the irrigation system. He carefully rerouted his sprinklers, making sure to flood certain sections of the yard. He didn't just want a damp garden. He needed the land to feel like a soggy, mosquito-infested mess. The tarps were laid out, one after the other, beneath layers of dirt. The goal was simple: trap water and keep it from draining away. He dug shallow ponds here and there, allowing the standing water to collect. Every time Jake took a step back and looked at what he was creating, he couldn't help but smile. It was a mess, a perfect mess. The swamp was taking shape. He was careful to plant native wetland vegetation along the edges of the new ponds. He made sure to select plants that would thrive in wet conditions, knowing that they would further reinforce the idea of a wetland. Then came the frogs and tadpoles. Jake released dozens of them into the water. They swam in, instantly at home in the new environment he was shaping. He had read up on how quickly they would multiply, and the thought of hundreds of frogs filling the yard made him chuckle. It was perfect. The swamp would have everything it needed: water, mud, plants, and frogs. As the days passed, the transformation continued. The frogs croaked loudly in the early mornings and late evenings, filling the air with their calls. The mosquitoes followed suit, swarming in the stagnant water, making the place unbearable to anyone who might try to walk through. Jake's backyard was no longer a lawn. It was a swamp, a thriving wetland that was practically impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, Karen and the HOA had no idea what Jake was up to. They had their sights set on claiming his property, and Jake was ready to show them just how much of a mistake that would be. The more he worked, the more he felt a sense of satisfaction. It was a bold move, but he was confident it would work. If Karen thought she could take his yard, she was in for a rude awakening. The day Jake finished his swamp, he stood in the middle of his backyard, looking at the mess he had created. The water pooled in the small ponds, the plants thrived, and the frogs hopped around, oblivious to the chaos they were part of. Jake felt a rush of excitement. This was it, the point of no return. His yard had gone from a manicured lawn to an impenetrable swamp, and Karen wouldn't be able to touch it now. He had made sure of that. He sat on his porch that evening, sipping a drink as he looked out over his newly transformed yard. The sounds of the frogs croaking and the buzzing of mosquitoes filled the air. It was everything he had hoped for: messy, loud, and completely unappealing. He was sure Karen and the HOA would be horrified when they saw it. They thought they could just waltz into his backyard and take it, but now they were about to face a swamp they couldn't control. The transformation was complete. Now it was time for Karen to see what he had done. Jake watched from his porch, sipping his coffee, as Karen and 2 HOA members approached his house. It was the moment he had been waiting for. His backyard, now a fully transformed swamp, was practically unrecognizable. The once neat lawn was a muddy, waterlogged mess. Mosquitoes swarmed over the standing water, and frogs croaked loudly, making the air thick with noise. Jake couldn't help but smile as he saw the disgust on Karen's face when she first laid eyes on it. Karen marched straight toward him, her face twisted in fury. "What have you done to your yard, Jake?" she snapped, waving her hands in the air. "This is absolutely ridiculous. You've ruined everything. You're sabotaging the neighborhood." Jake stood up slowly, setting his coffee cup aside. "Oh, Karen, I didn't ruin anything. I've simply made use of my land in the best way possible. And by the way, it's now legally protected as a wetland." Karen's eyes widened. "What? You're telling me you turned your backyard into a swamp on purpose?" "Exactly," Jake replied calmly. "You wanted a park? Well, here it is. You didn't listen when I told you I wasn't interested in giving up my yard. Now it's a protected wetland, which means you and the HOA can't touch it." Karen looked at the ground, her face pale, before glaring back at him. "You can't just turn your yard into a wetland and expect to get away with it." Jake folded his arms. "Actually, I can. Local laws protect wetlands, Karen. This place can't be developed or altered. So, no matter how much you push, there's nothing you can do about it now." The 2 HOA members, who had been standing silently behind Karen, exchanged uncomfortable glances. They clearly hadn't anticipated Jake's move. One of them, a man who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "Is that true, Jake? Are we really stuck with this swamp?" Jake nodded, his expression unwavering. "Yep, it's all legal. I made sure of it. You can't just claim someone's property, especially not when it's protected by environmental laws. Karen's face twisted into a mask of frustration. This isn't over, Jake, she spat. I'll find a way to fix this. But Jake stood firm. I don't think you will. This land is mine. You can't take it from me, no matter how hard you try. The conversation turned into a standoff. Karen and the HOA members stood there, clearly deflated, while Jake calmly watched them. The realization that they had no more legal ground to stand on seemed to sink in slowly. Jake's once peaceful yard, now a chaotic swamp, had become his defense against their attempts to claim it. As Karen opened her mouth to argue further, a neighbor from down the street stepped forward. Hey, Karen, the neighbor called out, clearly frustrated. We're all tired of hearing about this so-called park. Ever since you started pushing for this idea, our whole neighborhood's been a mess. Jake's yard isn't the only place that's been affected. I don't know why you thought this was a good idea, but you've made everything worse. Another neighbor chimed in. Yeah, my kids can't even play outside anymore without getting eaten alive by mosquitoes. You should have listened when people said this was a bad idea. Jake's eyes widened. It was the first time he'd seen his neighbors stand up against Karen, and it felt good. Karen looked around, her face flushed with anger, as the murmurs of agreement from the other neighbors grew louder. She tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear that the tide was turning against her. Karen gritted her teeth and shot Jake a look of pure rage. You can't stop me, Jake. I'll take this to the HOA board. We'll fix this. Jake shook his head. Go ahead, Karen. But remember, I've got the law on my side now. This swamp is staying right where it is. As Karen turned to leave, the HOA members followed, their shoulders slumped. Jake felt a weight lift off his chest. He had won. Finally, after all the harassment, the threats, and the manipulation, he had outsmarted them. His property was his again, this time for good. Over the next few days, Jake noticed a shift in the neighborhood. People stopped complaining about his swamp, and some even started to appreciate it. His backyard, once the subject of anger and frustration, became a quirky feature of the neighborhood. More and more people walked by, some even taking pictures of the frogs and the lush plants that had started to thrive. And Karen, she disappeared from the HOA meetings. The once powerful woman who had tried to control everything in the neighborhood now found herself isolated, without the support of the community. Jake sat on his porch that evening, watching the frogs hop along the edge of his yard. He felt a sense of peace wash over him. The battle had been long, but it was finally over. His backyard was safe, and the HOA was no longer a threat. The swamp was his victory, and he was finally free. The neighborhood had changed after Jake's victory. Karen's once strong influence crumbled quickly. The HOA tried to salvage their reputation, but the damage was done. Karen, embarrassed and defeated, resigned from her position as president. No one in the community trusted her anymore, and her push to take Jake's yard had only exposed how far she was willing to go for control. Now, she was the subject of every conversation, and her name had become synonymous with failure. Jake, on the other hand, found himself enjoying the calm that followed the storm. His backyard, which had been the center of so much drama, had transformed into a peaceful sanctuary. What was once a swamp was now a protected wetland, full of life and beauty. Neighbors who had once been critical now admired his decision. People from outside the neighborhood even began to visit, taking photos of the frogs and the plants. Nature enthusiasts came to observe the thriving wetland, and Jake found a new appreciation for the quiet beauty his backyard now held. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of pride and accomplishment. His property was safe, and the HOA no longer bothered him. He had stood his ground, and it had paid off. One evening, while sitting on his porch, Jake heard a neighbor complain about the loud frogs. "They're keeping me up at night," the neighbor joked. Jake couldn't help but laugh. It was a small annoyance, but in the grand scheme of things, it was a reminder of how far things had come. He had turned the tables on Karen, and now his backyard was exactly what he wanted it to be. His and only his.